Uh, Está outra vez a falar de reparations para os pretos, para os brancos pagarem aos pretos na América. Parece que gostam muito desse tema. Em vez de trabalhar, em vez de se esforçarem e trabalharem não é? Em vez de trabalhar, querem dinheiro grátis, não é? Querem dinheiro pago pelos brancos. Estão outra vez a falar de reparations na América. O facto interessante é o facto que o primeiro, o primeiro, a primeira pessoa na América a ter um escravo foi um preto. Vamos ver este vídeo.
Africans. Anthony Historians estimate that approximately 90% of the black shipped in the transatlantic slave trade were captured and then sold to Europeans by other Africans. Anthony Johnson arrived in the Virginia colony in 1621 after being captured in his native Angola by an enemy tribe and sold to Arab slave traders. After 15 years of indentured servitude, Mr. Johnson and his wife Mary gained their freedom. By 1651, the Johnson family owned 250 acres of land and had 4 white indentured servants and 1 black. On March 8, 1655, a
Outras palavras, ele teve dois escravos brancos e um escravo preto.
Hampton Court ruled in favor of Anthony Johnson, who was accused of unlawfully keeping his black indentured servant as a slave. The landmark decision made Johnson one of the Virginia colony's first legal slave owners. Historians estimate that approximately 90% of the black shipped in the transatlantic slave trade were captured and then sold to Europeans by other Africans. Anthony Johnson arrived in the Virginia colony in 1621 after being captured in his native Angola by an enemy tribe and sold to Arab slave traders. After 15 years of indentured servitude, Mr. Johnson and his wife Mary gained their freedom. By 1651, the Johnson family owned 250 acres of land and had 4 white indentured servants and 1 black. On March 8, 1655, a Northampton court ruled in favor of Anthony Johnson, who was accused of unlawfully keeping his black indentured servant as a slave. The landmark decision made Johnson one of the Virginia colony's first legal slave owners.
Isso quem diz, logo aí quem devia pagar, deviam ser os outros pretos que deviam pagar as coisas, mas a vida como escravo na América era bem melhor que a vida como um preto livre em África, mas bem melhor, nem sequer há comparação possível. Nem sequer há comparação possível, por isso o estilo de vida era bem melhor, era bem melhor ser escravo na América ou numa colónia europeia do que ser escravo de um mestre árabe ou de ou ser um preto livre em África, numa daquelas tribos, ou mesmo coisa, tinha acesso a comida, a roupa, a casa, a um teto, a segurança e eu recomendava vocês verem um vídeo do Alternative iPod chamado acho que é um vídeo que vocês deviam ver, em que ele dá... É um vídeo interessante que acho que eu recomendo muito a ver esse vídeo.
So in this video, I will be making a case for reparations. At first, I'm going to be arguing against some bad arguments for reparations. Don't worry though, as in the second part of the video, I will pivot towards making good arguments for reparations. I simply wish to remove the clutter of bad arguments that I think have actually stood in the way of achieving reparations. So first, what are reparations? When talking about reparations, the word gives us a clue as to what is meant. Repair, restore to a prior state, repar, or to undo the damage that was done previously. So in the absence of the Atlantic slave trade, what would be the standard of living of blacks who are currently in the United States? When talking about reparations for slavery, for example. Well, we can look to Africa to see that in 2017, the per capita GDP of sub-Saharan Africa was $1,554 per capita. The per capita GDP for the United States was $59,532 in 2017. But to get racial numbers, I did a crude conversion of median household income in the United States in 2016, which was $59,039, or 0.9917 times that of the per capita GDP in 2017, according to the World Bank. So with this divisor, I then took the median household incomes of blacks and whites and then divided them by 0.9917 to get a crude estimate of the per capita GDP of racial groups in the United States. With this, we have blacks at $39,820 per capita, or 26.52 times the material standard of living of blacks within sub-Saharan Africa. So reparations on these grounds would require us to massively reduce Black Americans' standard of living. And obviously that's silly, so this is not an area of argument that can be used for reparations. Now, one counter that is often brought up is that Africa was made poor by European action, making this comparison of US blacks to African blacks' living standard invalid. Two things to say about this. First off, the effect of European colonization on Africa, measured either by time nominally under European control or percentage of the population that is European, is causally related to the per capita GDP of blacks in those countries going up, which is evidence of a positive causal effect of colonialism. And if one is concerned about violent actions taken by these empires either to initially establish the European empires in Africa or to put down later anti-colonial revolts, keep in mind that life expectancy rose under European control, not fell. And this is probably a result of Europeans stopping intertribal war. Again, when talking about reparations, you have to ask what the prior baseline was. The prior baseline in Africa was also economic stagnation. Not only did sub-Saharan Africa stagnate at roughly $500 per capita in 1990 dollars prior to the Berlin Conference, which divided up Africa among the European states, but it had stagnated at this value from 1500 to 1881, which is to say, even during the 300-year period of regular contact with Europe through the slave trade, which is to say there was zero sign that Africa was going to be like Japan and radically change their society and change their economy in response to prolonged and significant European.
Pronto, depois vê-se o resto do vídeo. Antes de mais eu queria dizer que depois eu vou meter este vídeo no meu canal principal, main channel, no meu canal principal no final de agosto. Mas já vai ficar neste canal. Pronto. Como eu estava a dizer, pronto, mas recomendo que vejam este vídeo. E para além disso, tudo isso que estão a falar, escravatura, tudo isso aconteceu há mais de 200 anos atrás. E há outra coisa que é um mito que os pretos adoram espalhar, e a esquerda, porque a esquerda garante votos e aos pretos garante dinheiro grátis, é o mito de que a maioria dos pretos que vivem na América são descendentes de escravos, e não é verdade. A maior parte dos pretos não são descendentes, não estão não vivem na América, não vivem na América e estão na América porque os antepassados vieram como escravos. A maior parte, a probabilidade, mas é, a maioria dos pretos na América vieram durante os anos 50 de países africanos e do Haiti e da América do Sul e do Haiti por uma coisa chamada 1952. Vieram através desta merda em que os imigrantes deixaram de vir principalmente da Europa e passaram a vir principalmente da África e da América do Sul. E é a razão porque por isso, a probabilidade de ser afro-americano e ao mesmo tempo ser descendente de escravos é menor que a probabilidade de ganhar o Powerball, que é uma coisa de tipo Euromilhões que existe na América, só que é um bocadinho mais fácil de ganhar que o Euromilhões. Por isso, a probabilidade de ser afro-americano e ao mesmo tempo ser descendente de escravos é menor que ganhar a Powerball. Por isso, a maioria dos países tem nada a ver com escravatura ou tem qualquer tipo de direito de receber free money por causa da escravatura.
I only have 9 things to say about this stupid theme. 1. Being a slave in the USA, Europe and European colonies was far better than being black free in Africa or e.g. being Russian free in Russia or e.g. East European in East Europe in 17 and 18. 2. Greater Afro-America today do not descend from slaves of the 17, 18 and 19 that were brought from Africa. Most likely you will win your Powerball or be president in the next 50 years that will be descending slaves brought in the past. Most African Americans are currently descendants of immigrants from Africa thanks to the 1950s nationalization of the Naturalization Act. 3. But for those who are descendants of slaves, look at Uganda, look at South Africa, look at Liberia, look at Zimbabwe. Look at Angola and look at Mozambique, then compare type of life that these Nestier countries with type of life that exists in America. Even Detroit is much better than the best city in those countries. 4. Since Europeans arrived sub-Saharan and colonies where no one lived, life expectancy of the African population, sub-Saharan Africa people. Infant mortality reduced by 1/4 in epidemics of cholera and malaria to half. 5. White people used slaves that were already slave by own tribe or family or Arabs. They should not then ask reparations to Arabs or other blacks. Arabs castrated slaves, the Arabs slaughtered slaves when they had just used them. And that is why they were particularly sub-Saharan people in present-day Saudi Arabia. 6. When we, black people, use clothes is cultural appropriation. Was white people, mainly Portuguese, introduced clothes in Africa population. 7. Please I implore see this video. https://www.youtube.com/watch?v=figurexvpffm9. Please see this video also if it is possible. https://www.youtube.com/watch?v=31e1 Goica 10. Afterwards, they cannot be surprised with incidents like the one of the day the 15th of March in New Zealand. Nice until we're not.
Pronto, eu não tenho. Isso, eu não tenho direito nenhum a reparations. Na minha, eu depois gostava também de fazer um vídeo sobre o LGBTQ PZ mesmo, e sobre o mundo da palhaçada que está a se tornar nosso mundo. Antes de mais, vou deixar aqui mais um vídeo agora intitulado "An Alternative Look About Slavery". Também recomendo que vejam este vídeo.
Perhaps to reduce emotionality, replace slave with serf or peasant, which is appropriate since in practice they were the same thing. One system had a master who owned a slave, the other had a lord who owned land that a serf was bound to work on. Both had a belief that the master or lord would often sleep with his subjects' wives, prima noctis or right of first lie, and nobody had a conniption when the British Broadcasting Corporation does a documentary saying English peasants didn't have it that bad. So it's not unreasonable to think that chattel slavery in the United States would be a similar story, wherein the chattel slaves didn't have it that bad. Today in the United States, height is mainly a function of genetics, as starvation
because people failed.
Or chronic hunger is freakishly rare. But until the 1900s, chronic hunger and lack of food was a factor in height in the United States, with wealthier populations being visibly taller than poorer ones. Today, blacks are roughly the same height as whites, very slightly shorter actually, and this surprises some people. From the paper A Peculiar Population, the Nutrition, Health, and Mortality of American Slaves from Childhood to Maturity, Richard Streckel compared the height percentiles of black slaves to contemporary white populations at adulthood. And so we can see that in adulthood, black slaves, despite being roughly the same height as whites today, were taller than most whites in the world at the time, with the exception being English aristocrats and Swedes, including people who initially settled Minnesota. Now, how can this be if slaves were as viciously exploited as some may believe? Alienated labor. Robert Evans Jr., in his paper entitled The Economics of American Negro Slavery, calculated the return on capital of slaves in the United States and compared it to money lending and railroads. So we can see that while black slaves had a higher amount of alienated labor than, say, railroad workers, the highest recorded here was 14.8% profit off of their labor. You could speculate it goes up the further back you go. Maybe. There's a linear trend from here, but that doesn't necessarily mean it projects back to 100%, back in 1700 or something. But the reality is that after expenses, black slaves got back, anywhere from 80 to 90% of what they produced on average. And given that the slave plantations were on some of the richest land in the world, the Mississippi River Valley especially, it's not hard to imagine that they were better fed than contemporary whites who, despite getting closer to 100% of what they produced on their land, by working on more marginal land, they ended up having fewer calories for themselves. In the 1870 census, 20.1% of blacks could read and write, compared to 80% of U.S. whites at the time. That same year, Russia, the whole country, had a literacy rate of around 15%. And most African countries didn't achieve a literacy rate of 20% that the blacks had in the U.S. had in 1870 until around 1950. Now, one could argue that U.S. whites should have done more to teach blacks how to read and write, but the idea that their literacy was kept down by the Atlantic slave trade is demonstrably false. Being shipped to the Americas benefited those blacks who were shipped to the Americas in terms of their ability to read and write compared to the population on the continent of Africa. Life expectancy. While black slaves probably grew to be taller than most whites in the U.S., their life expectancy was shorter. Now, it's possible that these are related, as caloric restriction is known to increase longevity. Now, you can look at these as percentages, i.e. what percentage of years do blacks have of whites, but this assumes that improvements in medicine and living standards scale linearly in effect. All we can say with certainty here is that blacks have always lived shorter lives than whites on average. Hours and difficulty of work. John F. Olson, in his analysis of southern cotton farms and northern farms, came to the conclusion that the average free farmer on a northern farm worked 3,130 hours per year, while the black slave worked 2,798 hours per year between 1850 and 1860. Robert Fogel, in Time on the Cross, claimed that the gang system, which usually included black slaves and a white motivator, was vastly more efficient per hour, saying, quote, "A slave working on an assembly line basis in cotton, sugar, and tobacco, the southern staples, produced as much output in 35 minutes as a traditional worker produced in an hour." So in other words, according to Robert Fogel, while they worked fewer hours, they worked so much harder that it was still worse. However, an analysis by Alan Olmsted and Paul Rode showed that free cotton farms were just as efficient per hour as the touted gang system, and they didn't even count the fact that the motivator wasn't doing any useful work. So blacks worked fewer hours, and there's no evidence that they worked any harder. More recently, in 2015, Trevon Logan did an experiment with his children, saying how much cotton they could pick per day, and compared that to the daily cotton production of slaves at the time, between 1850 and 1860. His results showed that his kids picked about 95% of what the slaves picked on average of the same age between 1850 and 1860. In my opinion, this experiment conclusively shatters the myth of the gang system and the myth that slave labor was uniquely and particularly difficult. Breaking up families. According to The Slave Family, A View from the Slave Narratives by Stephen Crawford, only 51.1% of black families had both parents co-residing. By 1880, this number had increased to around 70%, which is where it stayed until 1940, when it started to decline. By 2011, only 37% of blacks lived in two-parent households, while 75% of whites did. The breaking up families line on slavery was probably more compelling, maybe in 1960 or 1970, when blacks had nuclear families more than 51.1% of the time. Now, I don't know of any statistics on the percentage of black families at the time that were broken up by sale. So we don't know what proportion of the broken up black families during slavery was a result of being split by sale or for some other reasons. I can only find one quantitative record of how often corporal punishment was used, and that is the records of Bennett H. Barrow. The record spans a 23-month period, and over this period he issues 160 whippings, and he had 129 slaves. This averages to about 0.65 whippings per slave per year. However, having read through his records, Barrow seems like a bit of a sadist who enjoyed what he did, and so in my opinion, Barrow is probably not typical, but the system, in fairness, made it so that people like Barrow can have as much power over other people as he did. And that is an unavoidable reality of slavery, and why it's good that white people worldwide abolished it, not only in their countries but around the world. But I am shocked at how difficult it is to find any kind of statistics or data on corporal punishment of slaves during slavery. And you may think that something that is so often referenced in film and in essays and in presentations on other topics that somebody would have come along and tried to quantify this in some way, but I have not been able to find anything really other than the records of a single person who seemed to relish in hurting people. From Thaddeus Russell, A Renegade History of the United States, quote, "Statistics further suggest that rapes were rare on plantations. Most people of mixed race in the South were either slaves who lived in cities, where opportunities for interracial liaisons were greater, or were free. According to the 1860 census, 20% of urban slaves and 39% of free blacks in southern cities were mulattoes. But among rural slaves, who made up 95% of the slave population, only 9.9% were mulatto. Of the slave population as a whole, mulattoes made up only 7.7% in 1850 and 10.4% in 1860. Moreover, only 1.2% of the former slaves interviewed by the Works Progress Administration in the 1930s reported being raped by a master. Only 5.8% reported hearing about the rape of another slave, and only 4.5% said that one of their parents had been white. According to Fogel and Engerman from Time on the Cross, 1974, all of the available evidence taken together indicates that, quote, share of Negro children fathered by whites on the slave plantations probably averaged between 1 and 2%. Even Fogel and Engerman's most hostile critics concede that it was no more than 8%. There is also evidence of significant numbers of consensual relations between white men and slave women, which would make the percentage of children produced by rape even smaller. The subjective texture of the mind. If you've gone to public schools, these statistics I post here may seem at odds with the subjective texture of vicarious experience, i.e., how you feel slavery was, based on the stories and the narrative presented in public school. And it may seem cliche or ham-fisted that I'm referring to public school here, but this is where the belief came from. This is where and when it formed, is it not? There's a great book called They Were White and They Were Slaves, which is full of personal accounts of a very different world. In fact, a world much more similar to today regarding race and slavery. And here are some examples here, of some quotes. You know, boss, these days there's 3 kinds of people. Lowest down is a layer of white folks. Then in the middle is a layer of colored folks. And on top is the cream, a layer of good white folks. The slaves saw enough abject poverty, disease, and demoralization among the poor whites to see their own condition under old Massa's protection as perhaps not the worst of evils. There's a quote from Eugene Genovese, rather be a nigger than a poor white man. Slave perceptions of Southern yeomen and poor whites in Toward a New View of America. Next quote. When I was a boy, recalled Walters McIntosh, who had been a slave in Sumter, South Carolina, we used to sing, rather be a nigger than a poor white man. Even in slavery, we used to sing that. Gangs of Irish immigrants worked ditching and draining plantation, building levees, and sometimes clearing land of the danger to a valuable Negro slave property. George Templeton Strong, a Whig patrician diarist, considered Irish workmen at his home to have had prehensile paws rather than hands. He denounced the Celtic beast. Irish youths were sometimes called Irish slaves, or more frequently bound boys. A common joke in the South in the pre-Civil War period was that when blacks were ordered to work hard, they complained that their masters were treating them like Irishmen. A slave expressed no surprise that his master, who was Big Bruckra, never associated with white trash. and Rosa Stark, who had been owned by a big planter in South Carolina, reported that poor whites had to use the kitchen door when they went up to the big house. Her mistress had a grand manner, no patience for poor white folks. Frederick Law Olmsted, the landscape architect who designed New York Central Park, observed bales of cotton being thrown from a considerable height into a cargo ship's hold. The men tossing the bales somewhat recklessly into the hold were Negroes, and the men in the hold were Irish. Olmsted inquired about this to a mate on the ship. "Oh," said the mate, "the niggers are worth too much to be risked here. If the patties are knocked overboard or get their backs broke, nobody loses anything." John Randolph of Roanoke, Virginia, traveling in England and Ireland with his black manservant Johnny, wrote to a friend back home, "Much as I was prepared to see misery in the south of Ireland, I was utterly shocked at the condition of the poor peasantry between Limerick and Dublin. Why, Sir John, the slave, never felt so proud of being a Virginia slave. He looked with horror upon the mud hovels and miserable food of the white slaves, and I had no fear of his running away." This is me interjecting here. It's interesting that he referred to those Irish people as white slaves. Now, obviously, this book, they were white and they were slaves, and its quotes, they only tell one side of the story. They're going to give you a one-sided perception of how things were at the time. But that's the whole point. They're giving you that side of the story, that side of the subjective narrative. I'm not saying that these narratives or these quotes or these individual perceptions of history at the time prove me correct. Just as there's an ocean of contemporary narrative that backs up my statistical claims, right? And these narratives portray the United States as having the same crust of anti-white elites who prefer foreigners to poor white trash. Now, why you have never heard of these kinds of narratives is a whole topic unto itself. Slaves in America would have been slaves in Africa anyway. Based on the fact that 41% of all blacks in West and Central Africa prior to European conquest, okay, this is important, prior to European conquest, were slaves, the extreme increase in price of slaves from the relatively small increase in demand that the Atlantic slave trade represented, and the anecdotal evidence that more slaves were put to work within Africa following Britain's global ban on slavery, we can say that Europeans likely did not cause a single black person to be a slave who wasn't already going to be one, or at least a very small proportion of them. So 1, the population of West and Central Africa from 1500 to 1800, right? So we can look at the population data on Central and West Africa by year. All right, if you want to read these, you can click on the pause button in the video, or you can click on the link and go to the article and just read the tables themselves. So I'm just going to flash these up here in the video here. And so the populations of West and Central Africa as regions averaged to 31.83 million over the years 1500 to 1800. I'm not bothering to weight it, and it's not going to matter because the magnitude of the case is going to bury any discrepancy between a weighting of this. So just taking an average over all the years is not going to matter that much, as you'll see later. 2, the proportion of slaves in West and Central Africa. Now here is Encyclopedia Britannica's claims for the proportion of slaves in various African states. And I'm going to flash this on the screen in the YouTube video. You can pause it, or if you want to, I would recommend going to the article so you can read it more clearly if you want to read it there. And what we can see, looking at, say, Sokoto, the Fulani Jihad states, and all these other various regions, and these states that approximate to various regions, we see like 1/2, 1/2, 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, 1/2, 1/3, 40%, 15% to perhaps 75%, 1/3, 1/2, 1/3, 1/3, 1/2, 1/2, 1/2, 1/2. If the estimates for the proportion of the population that are slaves in all these regions are treated as being precise, with 1/2 being 50%, 1/3 being 33.3 repeating percent, okay, this all averages out to 41.61% of the population of Africa having been slaves between the years that are listed here. So Now, if these numbers seem extreme to you, like 41.61%, that seems really, really high. Well, remember that Athens was said to have been about 1/3 slave, and the whole of the Confederate States of America was approximately 1/3 slave. So these are not outrageous numbers for known slave societies. 3. The number of slaves in West and Central Africa. So we have a good idea on what the population of West and Central Africa was, and we have consistent subjective estimates of the proportion of people that were slaves in those regions. The next question is how many people were alive in West and Central Africa from 1500 to 1800? Well, the average year of childbirth in African countries is today around 27. So if we assume that the average was 25 back in 1500 to 1800, then we have a generation time of 25 years, right? And the generation time is the average age at which a person's mother was when they were born. Okay. So there are roughly 382.2 million people who lived in West and Central Africa from 1500 to 1800 doing this equation here. If 41.61% of those were slaves, then this would give us 159 million slaves in West and Central Africa between the years 1500 and 1800. Okay. Atlantic slave disembarkations. Now, roughly 12.5 million slaves disembarked from Africa between 1525 and 1866 to the Americas. Over that same period, we would expect there to have been 484.63 million people to have lived in Africa, and of those, 201.65 million would have been slaves between 1525 and 1866. And so based on this, the Atlantic slave trade was about 5.84% of the total slave trade within West and Central Africa at the time. 5. The inelasticity of supply. Elasticity of supply is a fancy way of saying, does quantity supplied increase in response to an increase in demand? For slaves, if the supply is elastic, that means that the suppliers of slaves can easily supply more slaves if the demand goes up. They can easily go out there and get some more slaves. If it is inelastic, well, that means that suppliers can't very easily get more slaves just because more people are willing to buy them. And if it's perfectly inelastic, that means they can't get any more. That means they have completely maxed out slave production. It doesn't matter how much people are willing to buy a new slave, they just can't get it. They just can't get any more. Okay? That's what perfect inelasticity would mean. Now, if the supply is inelastic, then any increase in demand will simply result in the price of slaves increasing. For example, if the supply of slaves was totally fixed and could not be increased, then new buyers would simply bid out the previous buyers for whom the slaves are now too expensive. And here we can actually compare the price of slaves in Africa. The number of slaves shipped to the Americas in the prior 24 years, roughly a generation time, their price in Africa, and the Atlantic slave trade as a percentage of the overall trade in Central and West Africa. Okay? And I have a table here showing this, and again, I'm going to flash it on the YouTube video, but again, I recommend going to the article to see that table. Now, the extreme increase in price in response to the very small increase in quantity demanded that the Atlantic slave trade represented is evidence that Africans couldn't readily just increase the supply of slaves, i.e., there wasn't much or any, if any, excess supply with which to supply the Europeans. So they would have to either sell some of their slaves they were already using or pick up arms and go try to enslave some peoples who up to that point had managed to resist enslavement. Now, the price increases are not necessarily entirely caused by the increase in demand over those years. Okay, it's impossible to say with any precision what caused the price increases, but the general pattern seems to indicate extreme price inelasticity, with an 8.293% increase in the relative quantity demanded of slaves, coinciding with a 453.453% increase in price. and then a 0.247 increase in relative quantity demanded, coinciding with a 45.741% increase in price. This indicates extreme inelasticity of supply. Again, there are all sorts of other factors that could be at play that we don't know about. However, the limited data that exists points to extreme price inelasticity, which is evidence of inelasticity of quantity supplied, which is a long way of saying that it looks like the Africans couldn't increase the number of slaves, that the supply was basically fixed, basically maxed out, and as a result, when new buyers came along, what ended up happening was the price of slaves just shot through the roof. According to the Encyclopedia Britannica article, quote, after the limiting and then abolition of the transatlantic slave trade, a number of these African societies put slaves to work in activities such as mining gold and raising peanuts, coconuts, sesame, and millet for the market, close quote.
Alça gira é quando eu onde é que eu ia? Alça de Gira é uma organização, é um canal que é pago por uma empresa, pelo Estado de Qatar, que é um Estado Islâmico ditadura, que financia ataques terroristas aqui na Europa e que ainda agora usa a escravatura pessoas vindas da África e da Malaya. Por isso, isto aqui é taquia. Este vídeo é autêntica taquia.
Now, of course, this quote from the Encyclopedia Britannica is not data, but merely a subjective impression, being that the end of the Atlantic slave trade did not result in fewer black slaves. They just stayed in Africa and were put to work doing other things. And when roughly 40% of the population is enslaved and people resist with violence being enslaved, it's certainly not difficult to imagine that the supply of slaves was probably quite inelastic, i.e. very difficult to increase any further. I mean, you know, once you have 40% of the population that's slaves, you know, you're really hitting well, I don't want to speculate as to, you know, point of diminishing returns or the end of low-lying fruit on this, but I think that's what was happening. Our hands are clean. The life of a slave in the Americas was certainly better than the life of a slave in Africa. It's possible that the average non-slave African had a better life than the average slave in the Americas.
Ele está a dizer escravo preto em África, ele quer dizer um escravo preto em África. Em África, em Comestre, é outro preto, ou o dono do escravo é outro preto, não é as colónias europeias em África. Está a dizer, o que ele quer dizer é um escravo preto que o dono é outro preto, não é? E já agora, eu falo agora também de outra coisa. Qual eram as três maneiras? Como é que uma pessoa se tornava escravo em África? Ou era capturado por um muçulmano, ou era capturado por um muçulmano e era levado para o Oriente, que era bem pior do que ser escravo na América ou numa colónia europeia, ou nascia numa tribo em que era hábito, quando havia filhos a mais, com método de controle de população, usar os filhos como escravos. Era extremamente comum. Há muitas tribos em África que literalmente vendem os filhos quando têm excesso de população. É um bocado como os hamsters comerem as crias. É uma situação semelhante. Ou durante guerras tribais era capturado, uma pessoa era capturada e tornava-se escravo, ou e era um dos mais comuns, seria eram criados o chefe da tribo dizia, olha, precisamos mais escravos, e dizia, agora tu e tu vão fazer filhos e esses que crias vão ser escravos. Era uma das várias maneiras, 4 maneiras que acontecia de uma pessoa se tornar escrava em África.
That's a possibility, but that's not the relevant comparison here. And first off, we don't really even know that to be true, but that's not even the relevant comparison. Because let's say that the Atlantic slave trade did not create a single slave, that it merely moved slaves from Africa to the Americas, who ended up having a better life and a better chance of surviving, even taking into account the Middle Passage. And of course, with the Middle Passage, that's like a one-off event. Like later generations don't have to deal with that anyway. So
before saying anything about the...
If this is true, would we then say that the Europeans engaged in a wicked act by buying African slaves? Consider that if the Europeans did not...
E é engraçado que o mesmo pessoas que dizem então ok, mas os europeus compraram escravos e por isso devem pagar reparations por causa de comprar escravos. São o mesmo tipo de pessoas que dizem que vender drogas deve ser ilegal, mas comprar drogas deve ser ilegal. E que ninguém deve ser castigado por comprar drogas, mas que por vender devem ser castigadas, presas, pagar uma multa, seja pena de morte, lá o que é que... Há pessoas que dizem que vender deve ser ilegal, mas comprar não deve ser legal. Pronto, então por essa mesma lógica, comprar escravos não tem culpa nenhuma e não é um ato maléfico. Vender escravos aqui e os brancos só compraram escravos, não venderam nem capturaram.
Not engage in this act, those slaves would have remained in Africa, where they would have been more likely to die, where their lives certainly would have been worse. They would have still been slaves. In this case, the Atlantic slave trade improved their lives relative to staying in Africa and remaining a slave in Africa. So whether or not the Atlantic slave trade was immoral is totally dependent on the elasticity of supply. Did the supply of slaves increase in response to the Atlantic slave trade, or was there a relatively fixed supply of slaves that was simply transferred out of Africa? And everything points to no increase in the number of Africans who are slaves, at least not to any quantifiable degree. If there was a slight increase in blacks enslaved, well, it's certainly less than the 12.5 million that disembarked from Africa. And exchange those 12.5 million, had a better chance of surviving, and certainly their progeny had a much better life than those who remained in Africa. Certainly today, like blacks who live in the United States today should be very thankful that, their great-great-great-great-great-great-grandpa or whoever got on that boat. We did not cause them to be slaves, nor was it our duty to buy their freedom. Nobody would be cursing.
E não se esqueçam, é mais provável ganhar a Powerball do que ser afro-americano e ao mesmo tempo ser descendente é mais provável ganhar a Powerball do que ser descendente. É mais provável ganhar a Powerball do que ser simultaneamente descendente. É mais provável ganhar a Powerball do que ser descendente de um escravo vindo da África e ao mesmo tempo ser afro-americano.
Europeans if they did not buy a single slave from Africa. Yet, if Europeans did not buy a single slave, those Africans would have been worse off remaining in Africa itself. But by doing something that made them better off, right, compared to inaction, which buying them and shipping them to the Americas did, Europeans are then condemned as if we caused their enslavement in the first place. The Africans were slaves to themselves well before we came along. We caused none of it. Only better conditions in the Americas and their eventual freedom. One common claim I hear floating around is that whites benefited from slavery, and that whites are as well off as they are because of the rents extracted from slavery. Different people have different variations of this claim, some claiming more than others. Obviously, the United States is not made out of cotton or tobacco or indigo today. The argument is not that blacks literally built the infrastructure of the United States. Now, if someone is making that argument, that's obviously false, since most rail was in the North and nearly all railroad workers during slavery were white. But the argument is that the profit off of black labor during slavery funded the industrial expansion. Now, we have data about the South and the black population of all slave states, including those that did not secede, was 26%, or 30.8% of just the Confederacy. Obviously, the Southern economy was itself a dead end, so this argument hinges on the South funding the Northern economy, funding the industrial expansion of the North, since the North was the ultimate engine of the U.S. economy, right? Not the South. Now, I'm not talking about morality or even about the conditions of slaves in this particular article. The topic here is about whether or not whites, on the aggregate, benefited from slavery at the time. And there are two aspects to this. First is the South funding the U.S. industrialization argument, the idea that Southern, that slavery, the profits from slavery funded industrial expansion elsewhere. That argument. And the second is about the direct expropriation of labor, right? How much did whites get directly from black slaves versus what they would have gotten investing in things other than slavery, okay? So one is the South funding U.S. industrialization. Now, the interesting thing here is that Northern agriculture was more valuable than Southern agriculture. In 1860, 65% of all United States farm acreage was in the North. Now, it's possible that Northern farm production was less than 65% of the value of what was produced, or even less than 50%, and that the South, even though it only had 35% of the used farmland, produced more money with its agriculture than what the North did with their agriculture. But there are reasons to not believe this. First are the overall values of farm products produced in the year 1860. Okay, and so this will be a chart flashed on the YouTube video. You can go look at the article itself if you want to see it more clearly. Now, the combined production of hay and potatoes gives King Cotton a run for its money. But the real value of U.S. farm production in 1860 was cereals. Now, I don't know what percentage of farms in the North and South produce cereals, but I do know that the farms in the North were more geared towards cereal production, wheat, oats, barley, corn, than the South was. Okay. And we also know that farmland in the North cost more per acre. According to Peter Lindert's study on farm prices in the paper entitled Long Run Trends in American Farmland Values, and again, another table here, which you can look in the video. You can pause the video, look at it, or go to the article to see more clearly.
Okay.
And looking at this table, we can see that there are lots of reasons that land would cost more in the North. I'm not saying that the additional cost was entirely a function of the Northern land having additional yield, that Northern agriculture being better per acre. But the fact that it did cost more per acre than land in the South did makes the idea that Southern agriculture was in aggregate more valuable than Northern agriculture seem unlikely. Okay, if each acre in the North costs more than each acre in the South, it makes the idea that total Southern agricultural production probably does 1960. All right, and I have a link there. It's table 5 in that link. The federal government. So as it happens, no, the federal government was spending almost half. Was spending 42%. A disproportionate amount of federal infrastructure funds were going to the South. So if anything, the North, which was paying the bulk of the tariffs, slaves got 4.4 to 5% the South if they didn't have slaves and the resources. That's
They paid the fare to America, and there they melted in. Lovely Lady Liberty, with her book of recipes, and the finest one she's got. The great American melting pot, to the great American melting pot.
The good old days of Schoolhouse Rock. The song you just heard, called The Great American Melting Pot, written by Lynn Ahrens and Lori Lieberman, two famous Jewish-American composers, was pumped into my head as a kid almost every single morning before school. It played on the TVs of several million American children before their school day, and then was reiterated to all of us again and again, over and over throughout our entire time in American academia. But is it true? Was America really always founded as a melting pot of all different races and countless cultures? Was America truly founded and meant to be by our founding fathers to be a nation of immigrants from all over the world? As you can see, this phrase, melting pot, first started being used around 1908. The origination seems to come from a play written and performed by Israel Zangwill. Wikipedia describes this play as follows. The play depicts the life of a Russian Jewish immigrant family, the Kishanos. David Kishano has survived a pogrom, which killed his mother and sister, and he wishes to forget this horrible event. He composes an American symphony and wants to look forward to society free of ethnic divisions and hatred, rather than backward at his traumatic past. Now, the last time I checked, the Declaration of Independence was signed in 1776, and 1908, the year when the phrase melting pot first started to be used, was 132 years after that. But let's move on. How many times have you heard from your politician, your president, your standard Hollywood actor, and your local SJW that we are a nation of immigrants?
America is a nation of immigrants.
We are a nation of immigrants.
We are a nation of immigrants.
We're a nation of immigrants.
The next thing that follows this statement is usually some cringy cliche about the Statue of Liberty that's historically inaccurate, right?
And in the harbor is the Statue of Liberty, reminding us of who we are and where we came from.
See? Almost every single time. The Statue of Liberty, though, was a gift given to the U.S. from France to honor the centennial of American independence. The poem Upon It, which was written by Jewish writer Emma Lazarus, as you know, give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, etc., 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 was a later add-on and cri de coeur by Lazarus about her major concern, which was the Russian pogroms against the Jews happening in Tsarist Russia at the time. Lazarus was asked in 1883 to contribute a manuscript to an effort by New York socialites to help raise money for the pedestal on which the statue was to be erected. She at first resisted, but then ultimately decided to take the opportunity to further her real concern, which was the Russian Jews and the pogroms that were happening at the time. E Pluribus Unum explicitly commemorates the union of 13 British colonies into one nation. The statue and the motto do not celebrate immigration. They salute the achievement of the settlers who founded those colonies and in time won independence from their mother country. The poem on the Statue of Liberty has absolutely nothing to do with people vying for America to accept more and more immigrants, but has everything to do with what Lazarus was actually going through at the time. Anything else that is taught to you is historically inaccurate and completely made up by pro-open borders advocacy groups. Now, what about the term a nation of immigrants? Surely this phrase has been around since the Statue of Liberty was built up at least, right? Wrong. As you can see, this phrase wasn't even used until it became popular in the 1960s. It was popularized after the ADL asked John F. Kennedy to write a book with the same title that became part of a series by the ADL called A One Nation Library.
I'm honored to receive this award from an organization which on its 50th anniversary should itself be receiving an honor for distinguished contribution to the enrichment of America's democratic legacy. Your tireless pursuit of equality of treatment for all Americans has made a lasting and substantial contribution to our democracy.
As you can see, this phrase was literally a pro-open borders marketing slogan created by the ADL, a Jewish organization with over 100 years of history in the U.S., whose current CEO called Donald Trump anti-Semitic for using the word globalist during one of his meetings.
It was sort of developed and originated in certain extremist circles populated by white supremacists. But make no mistake, where the term originates from is a reference to Jewish people. It is not a coincidence that the word globalist is used to refer to Jared Kushner and Gary Cohn and Steve Mnuchin, the most prominent Jewish members of Trump's team of advisors. It is really disturbing when the president or his advisors like Mick Mulvaney or others in the media literally parrot this term, which is...
Os globalistas, como é ideal, estão a tentar destruir os nossos países.
Rooted in prejudice. No, a president should not use the term globalist.
The ADL also gave JFK the award he talked about earlier in that clip after writing his book. Now, this phrase that you constantly hear in your schools, on TV, in movies, and from your politicians came into mass use only 60 years ago. This was also right around the time that America's immigration system was starting to be called racist. This, as you know, eventually led to the U.S. going from a healthy mix of mostly Western-style European immigrants in 1950 to a massive increase in immigration, which is now pretty much only coming from Mexico.
There was a feeling in Congress that that same notion of ending discrimination should also be applied to U.S. immigration policy. Up until 1965, U.S. immigration policy was heavily biased in favor of Europeans.
So what exactly changed? What law was passed that the American people had no say in? What act was signed that sent us millions of a type of immigrant that is over 3/4 on one or more welfare program, that tears down our statues demanding change in our country, that hoist no other flag but the flag of their homeland while advocating the government be overthrown, that say it's racist to be white, and that bring mob destruction to those who advocate for a secure border, less government, and the restoration as well as the protection of our Constitution? Well, in comes Emanuel Celler, one of the main creators and the driving hammer on the nail that is the Hart-Celler Act of 1965. Who is he? Well, his biography describes him as a Jewish-American congressman who died of pneumonia in 1981. It goes on to talk about his major role in pushing for the legislation that eventually was successful in changing what they called back then the unjust immigration policy of America, which even as recently as 1960 had strict caps of immigration coming from south of our border. Within his bio, he is quoted in saying, "Yes, I fought against the unjust restriction of immigration." But who is the face of this bill exactly? Who would be the one to get it through the Senate after Celler crafted it? Well, remember the guy who kicked off the slogan, "A Nation of Immigrants" for the ADL? Well, his flesh and blood and brother Ted Kennedy was tapped for this job. After the bill was signed into law, Ted Kennedy, the literal lady killer himself, trotted out on stage and promised the following about this bill. Out of deference to the critics, I want to comment on what the bill will not do. First, our cities will not be flooded with 1 million immigrants annually. Under the proposed bill, the present level of immigration remains exactly the same. Secondly, the ethnic mix of this country will not be upset. Contrary to the charges in some quarters, this bill will not inundate America with any immigrant from any one country or area, or the most populated and economically deprived nations of Africa and Asia. In the final analysis, the ethnic pattern of immigration under the proposed measure is not expected to change as sharply as the critics seem to think. Thirdly, the bill will not permit the entry of subversive persons, criminals, illiterates, or those with contagious diseases or serious mental illnesses. As I noted a moment ago, no immigrant visa will be issued to a person who is likely to become a public charge.
Zero on the first time and $4 and child support. That's what I got.
Yet the 50-year-old single mother who entered the U.S. by swimming across the Rio Grande has government-funded housing, medication, and $700 a month in Social Security.
Obviously, that entire statement was a complete 100% lie as we know today. But then, after he lied on stage, another Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, was trotted out on stage as well and promised the following about the bill. In fact, he says, the distribution of limited quota immigration can have no significant effect on the ethnic balance of the United States. Total quota immigration is now 156,782. Under the proposed bill, it would rise slightly to only 164,482. Obviously, this is way, way off. But before the 1965 Hart-Celler Act, our immigration and naturalization laws were a lot more similar to immigration acts that were outlined by the founders and forefathers of America. Nationality acts like the Naturalization Act of 1790, which stated that should any alien wish to become naturalized in America, they would first have to be a free white person of good moral character that has resided in the country for at least 2 years. This was specifically written in the bill. Throughout the years, of course, this was amended several times, including in 1795, where they even made it harder to become a naturalized citizen, extending the minimum of 2 years residing in the country to 5 years in the country. Then in 1798, making it at least 14 years, and allowing the children of naturalized citizens to obtain birthright citizenship. All of which still kept the free white person of good moral character statement in the first lines of the bills. This Immigration and Naturalization Law of 1798 stayed exactly the same all the way up until 5 years after the American Civil War, when it was changed again in 1870 to allow freed black slaves to become citizens of America. From 1870 to 1924, immigration and naturalization pretty much remained exactly the same. As America was growing and only had around 50 to 90 million people in population, infrastructure needed to be built, and thus immigrants from Ireland, Italy, Britain, and the Scandinavian countries started to flow in. Contrary to what you're taught in your schools, as you can see, slaves did not build this country, its infrastructure, its canals, its bridges, or its skyscrapers. The Irish and Italians mostly did. But I digress. This all changed in 1920 when President Warren G. Harding signed the Emergency Quota Act into law in 1921. According to the new law, annual immigration from any country cannot exceed 3% of the total number of U.S. immigrants from that same country, as recorded in the U.S. Census of 1910. Then, the Immigration Act of 1924 went even further, limiting total annual immigration to 165,000 and fixing quotas of immigrants from specific countries. For instance, the act, which some know as the Johnson-Reed Act, completely banned immigration of Eastern European Jews. This was due to the recent Russian Revolution of 1917, which was started by Leon Trotsky, aka Leon Bronstein, and Vladimir Lenin, who were both Eastern European Jews. It was meant to keep subversives like them out of the country, along with anyone who followed the ideology of Karl Marx, who was also an European Jew. This act, of course, was only opposed by Emanuel Celler, who, as you know now, would change this all and immigration all, keeping our immigration rates as of people to
Europe is not going to be the monolithic societies that they once were in the last century. Jews are going to be at the center of that.
Well, the cool thing is in the U.S. is we have these things, these appeals courts, and these appeals courts just a few days ago said that we can't ban refugees from coming to the country. This is from Reuters. A U.S. appeals court on Thursday rejected the Trump administration's effort to temporarily bar most refugees from entering the country, ruling that those who have relationships with a resettlement agency should be exempt from an executive order banning refugees. So, you thought you could have sovereignty there, Americans? You thought you could decide who comes into your country? Nice meme, fam. Turns out you can't actually have control over your borders.
Well, yeah, and that's the biggest thing is there's this idea with immigration, which is so weird, that like we need immigration or we have to have immigration. I'm always so puzzled by this. It's always taken as a given that it's like, well, we can't close our borders forever. Like, what are you, a Nazi? Why the hell not? Why don't we get to determine who gets to come in here based on how they benefit our country? Why is it just a given that millions of people are pouring across our borders, taking advantage of the things that we built? And that's like, well, I mean, yeah, of course it's going to be that way. Immigration is a program that is designed, or rather should be designed, to benefit the people already in the country, not to benefit the people outside the country. And so, we're starting from a very problematic axiom to begin with, that immigration is a given. Right.
And we have this weird belief in this country, a lot of people do, that our Constitution and our Bill of Rights applies to every person in the world. And so when we were talking about the so-called Muslim ban on banning people into the country, people were saying, oh, that violates freedom of religion. Violates freedom of religion. You can't do that. Well, no, because freedom of religion and Congress shall make no law doesn't apply to foreign nationals. Like, it doesn't apply to everyone in the world. In fact, the president can ban anybody they want from coming to the country. And it doesn't require, like, according to U.S. code, it does not require the approval of other branches of government. But because these judges believe they have the power to set policy, they apparently decide that it does. But no, like, immigration is not a right. You don't have a right to come in this country. There's no guarantee that just because you are a human being, you'll be allowed into the United States. It doesn't work that way. Like, we should be taking you only if you're going to benefit us.
And you look at other countries in the like the Middle East, for example, where it's just not even an option. Like for Saudi Arabia, I mean, forget about it. You just can't go there. Israel, if you don't pass the genetic test, you just can't move there. And I just don't get it. People are like, well, yeah, that's fine. Of course, that's national sovereignty. That's their holy land. They get to pick. Well, how come we don't get to pick? And then it goes full circle back to, well, Americans don't matter, and we don't have the same rights as everyone else, and we don't have the same authority and sovereignty as everyone else. Saudi Arabia, Israel, they could do whatever they want. They could bring in everyone they want, or they could bring in nobody, and that's fine. But in this country, everyone has a right to come here, whether they're from Madagascar or they're from Tanzania or Mexico, and it doesn't matter if they can contribute. It doesn't matter if they have a big family. It doesn't matter if they can work. That's their human right. And if you're starting from that point, you're never going to get to where you need to go.
Yeah, and according to the Israeli government here, I'm reading the Israeli immigration policy. You can't immigrate to Israel unless you are Jewish. Like you can't immigrate there. Like, just can't do it. You have to speak Hebrew. You have to waive your other citizenship. Isn't that weird that they require you to give up your other citizenships?
That's weird. I wonder why they do that.
Well, isn't it weird that we don't do that, and we have people who have cross citizenship with other certain nations across the world, certain Middle Eastern nations? Isn't that strange? Doesn't it really make you think? So they're very strict about who can come into their country. I think we should use Israel as a model for how to establish our immigration laws.
Yeah, for a lot of things. I think a lot of things Israel does, we should do.
Yeah, like their wall that they built. I just think that's so funny that we give Israel every year, these $36 billion.
É uma coisa que também nós temos muito que aprender com os judeus. E fazer da mesma maneira que os judeus fazem, mas fazer para nós.
3.6 billion or whatever. Yeah, 3.6 billion. And that could fund, quite a bit of the wall if we were to use it that way. But instead, we give it to a nation that just bombed Syria again. Yes, awesome. We're subsidizing yet another foreign war. I can't wait. I love it. I just love blowback, right? I just love being the piggy bank for worldwide aggression and having that come blow back on us. That's awesome.
Yeah, me too. It's totally worth the money, right? I love to see our dollars going over so that, instead of us starting the wars, we could have our wars started for us by foreign nations. Meanwhile, we have to scrimp and save to build our own border wall. It's just, what are we doing? What are we doing anymore, James? I don't know.
It's America last. The way that our country's set up is to put America last always. In every way. We're an America last country. And that's why it's such a shock to the transnational elite when someone comes along and says, hey, let's put America first. Let's pursue policies that put America first. That's why there is so much hand wringing whenever that happens, because that's not the way things are supposed to work.
Yeah, I had a debate with Aaron Bandler from Daily Wire, that little bald pot-bellied goblin about so we debated on Israel's foreign aid money, and he told me, I was like, well, we have to put America first. And he said, actually, America first is an anti-Semitic slogan from Charles Lindbergh 70 years ago. And I'm like, oh, so anytime we advocate for our interests, that's necessarily anti-Semitic? I don't think so. Not today.
Nice try. How are these people any different from the left? Because that's exactly what the leftists say. They say, "Oh, America first is racist. It's bigoted. It means you're a bigot." And they bring up this Charles Lindbergh.
America last, and it's because there's no argument for it. There's no justification for it. They cannot have that argument besides the you're a white supremacist.
Failed to accept and explore the alternative hypothesis, which turned out to be factually correct.
Who does that? Who calls somebody by their first, middle, and last name? Isn't that kind of weird? Isn't that kind of culty? He's not Martin, but Martin Luther King. Contrary to what Republicans would like to imagine, Martin supported reparations and he supported affirmative action.
This is what we are faced with, and this is the reality. Now, when we come to Washington, in this campaign, we are coming to get our check.
Any attempts by Republicans to make Martin into something their own is both false and a recipe for defeat. Now, it's hard to remember.
Martin Luther King, até falar nisso, Martin Luther King é dos pretos que é afro-americano, mas não é descendente de escravos. Veio com o ato de 1950. MLK ou Martin Luther King, comunista, hardcore comunista, é daqueles pretos que é afro-americano, mas não é descendente de escravos, mas sim descendente de imigrantes que vieram com o ato de 1952. Que eu já mostrei aquele vídeo. Ele não é descendente de escravos, ele não é descendente de escravos, é descendente de imigrantes que vieram. Como estava a dizer, a Martin Luther King é daqueles afro-americanos que é daqueles pretos afro-americanos que não é descendente de escravos. Arthur Luther King Arthur Luther King, que era comunista, que era a favor de reparações, nós já provámos que os pretos não têm direito a nenhuma, pelo contrário, têm direito a pagar, não a receber. É um daqueles pretos que que é afro-americano, mas que não é descendente de escravo. Não é descendente de escravos, mas sim descendente de imigrantes que vieram graças ou por causa, para ser mais correto, o ato de 1952. Continua.
Remember when the first accusations were made, but at least
the alternative hypothesis, which turned out to be factually correct.
Who does that? Who calls somebody by their first, middle, and last
MLK
name?
era um afro-americano que não é descendente de escravos, é descendente de imigrantes graças ao ato de 1952, ou por causa do ato de 1952.
This is what we are faced with, and this is the reality. Now, when we come to Washington, in this campaign, we are coming to get our check.
Any attempts by Republicans to make Martin into something their own is both false and a recipe for defeat. Now, it's hard to remember when the first accusations were made, but at least since the 1970s, probably well before that, there were claims that Martin was a communist, not a real doctor, and that he had sex orgy parties. In 1991, after around 2 decades of denial, Boston University finally admitted that Martin plagiarized parts of his PhD thesis. Boston University formed a committee to investigate the plagiarism and found that Martin stole, verbatim, 33% of his dissertation, 45% of the first half, and 21% of the second half from another Boston University student, Jack Boozer. And that's just what the committee found. I suspect if a more hostile committee was looking at Martin's thesis, they would have found more plagiarism than that. Not surprisingly, the Boston University committee did not recommend revoking King's doctorate, despite a third of it being proven to be plagiarized. But this makes perfect sense, given that his speeches were written by others. For example, Martin's I Have a Dream speech was written by Stanley Levison and Clarence Jones. So far from holding our saints to higher standards than everyone else, it appears we hold them to even lower standards. This past November of 2017, the FBI files on Martin documents 4 mistresses he had, an illegitimate child he had, along with the fact that he worked with dozens of communists for planning events and writing speeches. Now, these things don't really carry the same weight they used to, but if released back then, this information would have sunk the image of St. Martin and reveal him for what he was, a dime-a-dozen black preacher who wanted Gibbs, who was just smart enough to read speeches written by men smarter than him. Why do you even know about Martin? Why is this figure sainted? Why did Martin's rabble-rousing even reach the masses? Well, because powerful institutions wanted it to. Martin couldn't have done anything without the press and without the universities, because all the newsmen, and later on all the academics and all the school systems wanted Martin to be a central figure. Martin himself was just a shell. He didn't write most of his speeches, at least not the ones anyone cares about, and he faked his way through college and was just a theologian anyway, didn't even get a real degree. But he was polished enough to ape the talking points of the power elite that wanted an end to white spaces. And Martin being a preacher and dressing up all this anti-white rhetoric, these claims of oppression in Christian language, that made it go down a lot easier. So why was he assassinated? Well, we can only speculate, but I think there's a clue in the FBI's dossier under the heading of Black Nationalist Terror. Quote, one serious danger in the confrontation lies in the proposed action of the black nationalist groups which plans to attempt to seize the initiative and escalate the nonviolent demonstrations into violence. King has met with black nationalists and attempted to solicit their support. Stokely Carmichael of the Student Nonviolence Coordinating Committee, an extremist black nationalist organization, has conferred with King. Carmichael endorses the objectives of King and advises he will not oppose or interfere with the Washington Spring Project's plans for nonviolence. However, he also states his role will be governed by what the SNCC decides. King is aware of the possibility of violence because one of his aides proclaimed recently to the press, quote, jail will be the safest place in Washington this spring. However, in spite of this potentially explosive situation, King continues his plans. He adroitly uses this possibility as a lever to attempt to pressure Congress into action by warning that the Washington Spring Project may be the last chance in this country for peaceful change with respect to civil rights needs. My personal theory, the powers behind Martin didn't want him to start supporting violent action and thus discredit their whole movement, and decided that Martin would be more valuable as a martyr than letting him be a potential trouble source, and that's why they put someone up to kill him. That his communist activity could come out, that his sex orgies and adultery could come out, and that he could start becoming more radical. But that's a bit speculative, and while you may be tempted to call me a kook for entertaining such ideas, remember that the people saying that Martin was a communist, plagiarist, and engaged in sex orgies were called kooks back in their day too, and they ended up being right, unless you think the FBI is making all this stuff up. What's the point of all this? Even if Martin was just a frontman for powerful interests, weren't his goals noble? Wasn't he fighting against oppression? For all his personal moral failings, wasn't his cause just? Well, that would assume that the blacks were actually oppressed. There's nothing oppressive about segregation. All countries are segregate from each other. The US is segregate from Mexico. Greece is segregate from Turkey. Your home is segregate from your neighbor's home. The Dominican Republic is segregate from Haiti. Laos is segregate from Vietnam. And nobody says the Dominican Republic is being mean to Haiti by keeping them out. No, that's a country's right. And that's a people's right. But the idea that there was some kind of oppression even beyond this segregation, well, these are stories you're told as a child, back when your mind is highly malleable, when you don't criticize anything, when your teacher says something and you just accept it. You're told stories about how put upon blacks were in slavery and then in segregation. But this whole narrative was established long before most of the research I'll be citing here was ever even done. The narrative was put in place before the homework was done. And the research I have here mostly comes from the National Bureau of Economic Research. And if you want to read the papers yourselves, click on the description, click on the relevant articles, and then click on the paper cited for the point you want to look at. So let's start with something simple: height. Now, black people today are actually ever so slightly shorter than white people today. This is something not a lot of people know because they watch the NBA and they imagine that black people are taller. No, they're actually slightly shorter. But during slavery, the blacks were actually taller than their contemporary whites, and this is evidence that their nutrition was probably better than whites. And back in those days, your standard of living was very closely related to your nutrition, and this is evidence that, at least in terms of relevance to nutrition, blacks back then were better off than whites back then on the whole. But what about expropriated labor? As slaves, they had all the value of their labor taken from them. Well, we know that the profit rate on slaves was around 12.69%. That's how much profit was made on slaves. By contrast, short-term money loans, which is an indicator of the profitability of the rest of the economy, were about 9.98% over the same time period. Now, this is lower than slavery, but remember, the business receiving the loan has to be more profitable than the interest rate on the loan is in order to pay it back, which means that the profit for the economy at large was probably about the same as it was for slaves, which means slave labor was being expropriated about as much as non-slave labor. So in terms of alienated labor, the value of labor taken from the black slaves, it was about the same as for the rest of the economy. But weren't they worked brutal, inhumane hours? Well, no. Slaves only worked around 89% as many hours per year as whites, around 2,798 hours per year versus 3,130 that the whites worked. In fact, Trevon Logan compared the volume of cotton picked per day on his family farm versus cotton picked per day throughout the South back then. And he found that his children on his family farm picked 95% as much cotton per day as the slaves back then did. So the idea that slaves were pressed to work particularly hard sounds like a myth. It seems like they only worked around 5% harder than family farms in the 1970s did. What about breaking up families? Well, no doubt it did happen, and that's always terrible, but to what degree? I couldn't find data on how often slaves were deliberately broken up, but consider that according to Stephen Crawford in The Slave Family, A View from the Slave Narratives, 51.1% of black slaves had intact families. By comparison, in 2011, only 37% of blacks had intact families. Now, what's interesting about this is that I remember in school hearing stories about broken up families, but then in the stories about blacks heading north to escape slavery, it's always intact families escaping north. It's almost as if the abolitionists who were telling these stories about blacks escaping north forgot that they had also told stories about the black families being broken up, and so they lost track of the lie. What about rape? What about voracious slave owners raping black slave women? Well, from Thaddeus Russell in A Renegade History of the United States, he writes, quote, "Only 1.2% of the former slaves interviewed by the Works Progress Administration in the 1930s reported being raped by a master. Only 5.8% reported hearing about the rape of another slave slave, and only 4.5% said that one of their parents had been white. According to Fogel and Angerman, all of the available evidence taken together indicates that the share of Negro children fathered by whites on slave plantations probably averaged between 1 and 2%. Even Fogel and Angerman's most hostile critics concede that it was no more than 8%. There's also evidence of significant numbers of consensual relations between white men and slave women, which would make the percentage of slave children produced by rape even smaller. But even with these reported numbers, how much of that is just hearsay or crying rape for the pity points it gives you? And compare this to today, where 22% of black women report having been raped. But also, just do a pinch test. How many white men have any sexual interest in black women whatsoever? Not a whole lot. And it's not an insubstantial number of white men who, if they were literally just straight up offered sex by what is considered to be an attractive black woman, would just say no. This idea that white men were going out of their way to rape black women in large numbers, it seems implausible given how many white men generally don't find black women attractive and wouldn't even have sex with them if offered. And on the issue of literacy, in 1870, the first census with any data on black literacy, we know that 20.1% of blacks were literate. Now keep in mind that in that same year, Russia had a literacy rate of 15%, lower than that of the US blacks. And the continent of Africa didn't achieve a 20% literacy rate until around the 1950s. And this is the relevant context. Compared to what? If blacks had not been bought from Africa, what would their lives have been like as slaves within Africa? I have an article where I use economic data and data on the number of slaves within Africa to talk about this. Because keep in mind, the Atlantic slave trade was only around 10.15% of the whole African slave trade. That the slaves that were sold from Africa into the Americas was only 10.15% of the total African slave economy. 72% of the African slave trade was all within Africa itself, and the rest of the world took up the remainder. Around 18% of the slave economy was the rest of the world, mostly the Middle East and India. And this was from the years 1525 to 1866. And of course, prior to the Atlantic slave trade, well, 100% of the African slave trade was within Africa or around the Middle East. And based on the inelasticity of supply, which simply means that supply can't be increased in response to increase in demand, there's strong evidence that the number of slaves produced in Africa did not increase or decrease with fluctuations in foreign demand. That the number of slaves produced within Africa was a fixed amount, and those slaves were bought and sold around the world. And when the Atlantic slave trade was cut off, the number of slaves within Africa that were produced didn't go down. They just stayed in Africa, and the number of slaves in Africa increased, which means the Atlantic slave trade did not increase the number of slaves. That was a fixed quantity. So Martin loved to wax poetic about the immorality of slavery. Well, if whites hadn't bought slaves from those blacks within Africa, they would all still be in Africa today and would be much poorer in every measurable way. So the act of buying slaves and shipping them to the Americas was at worst a morally neutral act, but really it was the best thing that could have happened to these people because they were going to be slaves either way. It was just a question of where. And the Americas, with the exception of a few Caribbean islands that were actually death camps, the Americas were a much better bet than the Middle East or remaining within Africa. So regarding reparations for slavery, what would that even mean? Would that mean that the blacks have to pay whites the differential between their standard of living in the US versus what their life would have been as a slave in Africa? No. The correct response for whites on the question of black slavery is you're welcome. But let's forget about slavery. Martin also liked to go on and on about the oppression blacks were facing at the time. Well, they weren't facing any systematic discrimination by the courts, not even in the Jim Crow South, compared to the way blacks are treated by the courts today. For first-time offenders, repeat offenders, black sentences were very similar to what they are today in terms of the racial ratios, even in the Deep South, where Jim Crow was supposedly the worst in Mississippi. Now, you can cite popular perception and black people throwing tantrums over having to follow the rules, and they did that back then and they do that now. But blacks throwing tantrums and cucky whites apologizing for them and writing speeches for them doesn't mean it's true, doesn't mean they're actually oppressed. Their complaining, their rage is not evidence that they're actually put upon. Because you can get mad and you can throw protests at will, whether something is unfair is being done to you or not. So the fact that they're having protests and that they feel put upon doesn't mean they're actually put upon. And in terms of going to prison as a multiple of whites, the ratio is much higher today than it was during segregation. This is also true for lynchings. The overrepresentation of blacks in lynchings was actually less than the current overrepresentation of blacks incarcerated for violent crimes today. Because remember, all these lynchings, they were all based on accused crime. The most common cause for lynching was cattle theft, not whistling at a white woman. No, it was cattle theft was the most common cause for lynching. And the total number of people lynched or hanged publicly by a mob, that's all it is, was around 5,000 people. I'm not supporting this mob justice, just like I don't support slavery. I'm just pointing out that they were actually less racially biased than the current legal system is. What about poverty? Well, blacks were obviously much wealthier than Africans, and they're much wealthier than most people on the planet at the time. And one thing to note is that as far back as 1880, when you controlled for the region they were in, when you controlled for the type of labor that they were doing, blacks earned 89% of what whites earned. But also, there's no reason to assume that in a meritocracy, blacks and whites would earn the same amount. There's just no reason to think that. Unless you have some profound evidence to the contrary, blacks earning 50% of what whites earn could be totally fair, could be a totally fair reflection of what they're doing. One thing that teachers love to bring up is that blacks had lower school funding, and this is a real big deal for them because teachers love to tell you about how they're underfunded. Black schools, on average, had about half as much funding per pupil as white schools. And back in the day, you could have said this and imagined that once you equalize the funding for schools, that the race gaps would go away. But we've tried that. The funding has been equalized, in fact, more than equalized, and the race gaps are as wide as they ever were. Shockingly, teachers will tell you how they always need more money and that they're always underfunded and that a school being massively underfunded is going to result in lower scores, right? And they'll literally always say this. So this may seem like a plausible sounding idea, but the truth is schools today and probably back then could do with less than they're getting. And the underfunding of the black schools, yes, it happened, but the presumption that it mattered is, I think, just a kind of a myth that teachers who work in schools like to say. But then there's the whole premise of this is absurd. Did whites ever even owe blacks equal funding? After all, whites were paying virtually all the taxes, and whites in the South didn't even consider blacks to be real citizens since they acquired their citizenship through a constitutional convention where the southern states were represented by union-occupied state governments. They didn't have any voice in the passing of the constitutional amendment that granted black citizenships. The white southerners themselves never actually agreed to blacks becoming citizens. And that's the absurdity of Martin's moralizing. He's demanding the sun and the moon from southern whites who never agreed to be countrymen with blacks in the first place, but had it imposed upon them by what they considered to be an invading foreign power. A bunch of whites further north who, to rub salt in the wound a little bit, they didn't even have to actually live with these blacks. The whites in the South were the ones who are going to have to pay the price of black citizenship. And on top of all this, whites didn't even benefit from slavery, not even at the time. Now today, we know that the net fiscal effect of blacks, what they get from government minus their taxes paid, is around minus $300 billion per year. So whites are paying a very heavy price for slavery today. That's about half the defense budget. But even at the time, Southern investment was directed towards the dead end of slavery, right? A kind of feudalism, while in the North, all the investment was being diverted into industry. At most, you could say that blacks made a few plantation owners very wealthy by working on cash crops, but whatever wealth that the black slavery generated for a few really rich whites in the South, that was more than wiped out by the cost of the Civil War. And that's really the most important takeaway. Blacks benefited massively from being slaves in the US as opposed to being slaves anywhere else, while whites have been paying heavy price for it. Even at the time, whites did not benefit from slavery. From having the southeastern United States be a pre-industrial backwater, to the cost of the Civil War, to having to deal with third world Gibbs voting of blacks in the US, to the direct financial cost of blacks in the US, the blacks have been nothing but a ball and chain around the neck of white America. So what was the noble goal that Martin wanted? Well, on top of US blacks being some of the wealthiest people on the planet, then and now, he was mad because they weren't as rich as the whites in the US. It's just envy. It's just greed. The black poverty Martin described in his speeches would be the life of kings outside of the US or Europe at the time. And given that blacks in the US at the time of Martin Luther King earned about 65% of what whites earned, that means they almost certainly had a higher standard of living than the average citizen of the Soviet Union, for example, the US's supposed mortal enemy, and a way higher standard of living than any Chinese or black African. But not just that. Martin didn't want just the money and the Gibbs and the stuff. No, Martin wanted to deny white spaces. Because whites like having their own pools. They like having their own churches. They like having their own schools free from the chaos that you get from black neighborhoods and black schools. Martin wasn't satisfied with just funding equality, with just getting the money from whites, with just taking their stuff. No, he wanted whites to let him into their clubs. I mean, what kind of a psycho thinks that way? This is not noble. This is not nice. This is not good. This is pushy and domineering and kind of sick. If someone doesn't like you, just stay out. What is your problem? What's wrong with you? Here's something most people don't realize. The 1964 Civil Rights Act didn't matter much because that just removed laws requiring discrimination. The big opposition to the civil rights movement, the forced association movement, came with the Second Act, which forced whites to allow blacks into their diners, into their churches, into their schools, into their pools, into their bowling lanes. What kind of a psycho thinks this way? What kind of psycho demands access to spaces set up by other people? Why can't us whites just have a place for us, just have a space for us? You have the whole rest of the planet for you. This theater is for the whites. One thing people like to say is that it's prejudice. Well, look, if it was prejudice, prejudice, prejudging, well then whites in the North would have a much more negative view of blacks than whites in the South do. But it's exactly the opposite. The more lily white someplace is, the more positive their views on blacks are. Prior to general emancipation, the city of Philadelphia did not have any kind of legal segregation between the races. And there was no neighborhood in Philadelphia that was majority black. And this is because the blacks who went to Philadelphia prior to general emancipation were those who earned their freedom prior to general emancipation. They were the higher quality blacks that managed to get out of slavery before Lincoln gave it to everyone. Now, there are no polls on white opinions at the time. However, there's no evidence that the blacks of Philadelphia were especially criminal or especially shiftless, and there was no movement by the whites in Philadelphia to quarantine them, to segregate them, to ghettoize them. It wasn't until after the Civil War that you had the mass influx of former slave blacks from the South that Philadelphia started to introduce segregation laws against blacks, confining blacks to certain parts of the city. And of course, those black areas very quickly turned into, well, Africa or Haiti. You know, wherever blacks take over an area, it turns into that. This was in response to the influx of the rest of the black population and learning about their ways, the ways of those that did not earn their freedom, but instead had it handed to them by Lincoln. And it was in response to the behavior, to the content of the character of these blacks that the whites in Philadelphia started to take action. It wasn't pre-Judice, it was post-Judice. It was a reaction to what they actually were. It was a response to the content of their character. For those like Martin who like to push the myth of prejudice, it's the exact opposite. Those with the most experience with the Negro, whites in the South, whites on the continent of Africa, are precisely those that form the most negative opinions of the Negro and support laws restraining him. Segregation, apartheid. If anti-Negro sentiment was a result of prejudice, as Martin seems to assume, then by all rights, whites in the North should be the most negative towards the Negro, and whites in the South should have the most positive views of the Negro, since they have the most experience with him. So what really can we say about St. Martin's Day? The man himself was a fraud. He was a front man for a larger movement, pretending to be some downtrodden preacher speaking truth to power when actually he was the agent of the powerful. His cause? Gibbs from Whitey and access to their clubs. This kind of childish, psychotic thinking was somehow transmuted into something noble, and somehow conning whites into thinking that blacks were oppressed. They never were oppressed. Whites didn't enslave blacks. They bought them from other blacks in Africa, and frankly gave them a better life in the Americas. A better life than most people in the world at the time had, than most of the serfs and peasants in Russia, China, and India had at the time. The alternative to this was that they would have remained not free, but slaves within Africa. By demanding things from whites, blacks are punishing whites for giving them this better life. Then whites freed the black slaves. In fact, ended slavery worldwide, but that's another topic for another time. And whites carved out segregate spaces for them, giving them their own neighborhoods, their own housing, their own schools. Not as good as what the whites had, but certainly better than what the typical Russian would have. But the blacks weren't happy happy with this. It wasn't enough. Sure, they were richer, they were living longer and healthier lives than most people in the world, but they were poorer than their immediate neighbors, the white Americans. They weren't keeping up with the Joneses, and they only earned anywhere from 60 to 70% of what whites earned, depending on the year you look at. Now, despite the blacks not having even earned this, but being sort of handed this by the whites, the blacks wanted not only what the whites had, but demanded that whites not be able to keep them out of their spaces. Now, when groups are actually oppressed, like the Armenians or the Greeks under the Ottoman Empire, they want independence. They fight for independence. The blacks never wanted independence because they were never actually oppressed. They wanted just the opposite. They wanted an end to segregation within the United States, the exact opposite of independence. They wanted more stuff from whites. They wanted more contact with whites. They wanted the end of the barrier between black and white spaces. That somehow they got it in their head that they had a right to access to whites. Do Arabs have this problem? No, even though the Arabs actually took in more black slaves than the whites did. The Arabs are off the hook because what the Arabs did is they castrated all the males and worked them to death. So nobody's demanding anything from the Arabs because they're all dead, right? No, if whites just outright exterminated all the blacks after the Civil War, would a non-existent black population be demanding all sorts of stuff from whites? No, they wouldn't. But because whites did not exterminate the black slaves like the Arabs did, now we must be punished. Now we must pay the price. We must pay a price that the Arabs don't have to pay because the Arabs exterminated all the blacks. If what I'm saying here seems hard to believe, look, how are the blacks today behaving? Whatever you think of me, whatever moral overlay you have on me, how are the blacks today behaving? They're behaving in a way that would only be defensible in the context of some sort of history of oppression. If you just looked at how they behave today and just took that in isolation, you would say that sort of as a group, they're shitty people. That's what you would say. It is only in the context of some sort of past oppression that you will see them as anything but just kind of shitty people. Now, what I'm saying is that the past is like today, that they were never oppressed back then, that being made to live in your own space away from whites, that's not oppression. You have your space, we have ours. Yes, your space is not going to be as good, but it's better than most spaces on the planet, and you have a right to improve it. The idea that they were never oppressed, that the way they behave now is the way they behaved back then, that should be your starting assumption. Anyone who wants to say that the past was radically deviant from how it is today in terms of how they behave, the burden has to be on them. If anything, my view shouldn't be called the alternative hypothesis, but really the default hypothesis.
Street Journal even. In that America, what hope do empirically provable facts have?
Well, you pinpointed something that's very ominous. When national and political discourse is no longer rooted in verifiable fact, then facts are interchangeable with opinions. Truth is whatever you want it to be. And I write in the book about the nature of the permanent lie, that all politicians lie, all governments lie, as I.F. Stone said. But they lie for expediency. So, for instance, Bill Clinton argues that by passing NAFTA, there will be many more American jobs, good jobs. Bill Clinton doesn't make that argument anymore because it's false, and who knows whether he knew or didn't know, but it's false. With a permanent lie, reality, facts doesn't matter. So Trump wins by a landslide. Trump has the largest inauguration crowd in the history of, it's
first guy to win Wisconsin in 50 years.
It's endless.
Not true.
Right. It's endlessly, but it doesn't matter. And then you have media platforms that, like Fox News, that will propagate or disseminate these lies uncritically. And that has corroded discourse in the United States. The institutions, in a functioning democracy, you have institutions, and you cited them, the courts, academia, the press, that their job is to make sure that people speak about a verifiable reality. Those institutions have become corrupted, weakened, destroyed. or replaced with systems Fox, Breitbart, all of these right-wing propaganda outlets masquerading as news. The court system has been taken over and is now being finished off with appointments from the Federalist Society, which is this ideological right wing. So, and that it creates a kind of schizophrenia where you may see reality in front of you, but reality is denied by the power elites and by the organs, the media platforms that disseminate the opinions of the power elites. And that really begins to sound like descriptions of totalitarianism someone like Hannah Arendt would write about.
I don't want to let the clock get too far away from us here without giving you an opportunity to speak to what you see as the prescription for getting America out of this farewell tour. And here's just a few of the ideas that you advance in the book. A $15 minimum wage, a ban on for-profit health care, a dismantling of nuclear weapons, ending trade agreements, giving citizenship to undocumented workers. What do you think implementing that menu of policies would change?
I think that it's about reintegration. So it's about taking this huge dispossessed segment of the American population and reintegrating them into the country. And of course, the opposite is happening through programs of austerity, slashing welfare. The original welfare program, which was cut by Clinton, 70% of the recipients were children. I mean,
it was called AFDC.
Yeah.
The C standing for children.
Yeah. Well, and the children were sold out. And there's been now a further slashing of availability of food stamps. So you're taking a population in distress and you are exacerbating that distress. So I wrote a book about the Christian right called American Fascists. And I came to the conclusion after 2 years of writing that book that the only way to battle the Christian right, which I see as a kind of Christianized fascist force, and I speak as a seminary graduate.
We should point that out. You're a reverend in the
Yes,
Presbyterian Church.
I am, yeah.
You are the Dr. Reverend.
That's right. So
Christopher Lynn Hedges.
The importance, I believe, to countering the magical thinking of the Christian right was rooted in the economy, in reintegrating them into the economy, giving them the kinds of jobs, the unionized jobs that were once available, where you had job security, job safety, a pension plan, medical benefits, and a salary that could sustain a family. That's all gone. And by making it worse, we are pushing larger and larger parts of the population into the embrace of demagogues, hate groups, or seeing them engage in behaviors that are willfully self-destructive. Suicide, for instance, the highest rate of suicide in the United States are middle-aged white men who realize that there's no place for them anymore. Yeah. And I quote Pope John Paul in his encyclical on work. Work is not just about the exchange of labor for wages. It is about status, dignity.
Because people failed to accept and explore the alternative hypothesis, which turned out to be factually correct.
Who does that? Who calls somebody by their first, middle industry? At most, you could say that blacks made a few plantation owners very wealthy by working on cash crops. But whatever wealth that the black slavery generated for a few really rich whites in the South, that was more than wiped out by the cost of the Civil War. And that's really the most important takeaway. Blacks benefited massively from being slaves in the US as opposed to being slaves anywhere else, while whites have been paying heavy price for it. Even at the time, whites did not benefit from slavery. From having the southeastern United States be a pre-industrial backwater, to the cost of the Civil War, to having to deal with third world Gibbs voting of blacks in the US, to the direct financial cost of blacks in the US, the blacks have been nothing but a ball and chain around the neck of white America. So what was the noble goal that Martin wanted? Well, on top of US blacks being some of the wealthiest people on the planet, then and now, he was mad because they weren't as rich as the whites in the US. It's just envy. It's just greed. The black poverty Martin described in his speeches would be the life of kings outside of the US or Europe at the time. And given that blacks in the US at the time of Martin Luther King earned about 65% of what whites earned, that means they almost certainly had a higher standard of living than the average citizen of the Soviet Union, for example, the US's supposed mortal enemy, and a way higher standard of living than any Chinese or black African. But not just that. Martin didn't want just the money and the Gibbs and the stuff. No, Martin wanted to deny white spaces. Because whites like having their own pools. They like having their own churches. They like having their own schools free from the chaos that you get from black neighborhoods and black schools. Martin wasn't satisfied with just funding equality, with just getting the money from whites, with just taking their stuff. No, he wanted whites to let him into their clubs. I mean, what kind of a psycho thinks that way? This is not noble. This is not nice. This is not good. This is pushy and domineering and kind of sick. If someone doesn't like you, just stay out. What is your problem? What's wrong with you? Here's something most people don't realize. The 1964 Civil Rights Act didn't matter much because that just removed laws requiring discrimination. The big opposition to the civil rights movement, the forced association movement, came with the Second Act, which forced whites to allow blacks into their diners, into their churches, into their schools, into their pools, into their bowling lanes. What kind of a psycho thinks this way? What kind of psycho demands access to spaces set up by other people? Why can't us whites just have a place for us, just have a space for us? You have the whole rest of the planet for you. This theater is for the whites. One thing people like to say is that it's prejudice. Well, look, if it was prejudice, pre-Judice, pre-judging, well then whites in the North would have a much more negative view of blacks than whites in the South do. But it's exactly the opposite. The more lily white someplace is, the more positive their views on blacks are. Prior to general emancipation...
Vocês perguntam em qual razão, porque é que eu estou a falar disto que está acontecendo na América, quando eu sou português e estou aqui em Portugal? Porque isto que está acontecendo na América, se nós não tivermos cuidado aqui em Portugal, vai ser o nosso futuro. Porque cada vez maior é a população vinda da África, somente da Somália, Angola, Moçambique e Eritreia. Cada vez é mais em Portugal. E já temos quase a mesma população preta em Portugal que a América tinha antes de 1952. Em breve vamos ter exatamente a mesma ou mais população negra do que a América tinha em 1952. E depois vamos ter ainda, e depois vamos começar a ter mais população negra do que a América tem, que a América tinha, por exemplo, nos anos 60. A esta velocidade. E eles são... eu não queria ser agora, mas eles só têm que salvar às vezes. Querem uma prova. O som é acrescentado, mas tudo o resto é tal e qual, não foi modificado em lado nenhum. Só o som é que foi acrescentado.
Intercontinental Championship match. It's straight ahead on SmackDown Live. The Miz said that his success pays the rest of the men's locker room's salaries, and SmackDown Live GM Daniel Bryan said, well, if that's the case, let's put them to work. Avoiding that kick and getting a 2 count, blocks the right hand, unloads a right of his own. And the lunatic fringe lighting up the Miz. Ambrose lands on his feet. And again, he's fighting off the Lumberjacks. Oh, Barrett face first into the ring post.
Agora, preto usarem roupa é cultural appropriation. Preto usarem roupa é cultural appropriation.
Ambrose lands on his feet. And again, he's fighting off the Lumberjacks. Ambrose going all the way up to the high red district. Lunatic fringe elbow. Cover. Oh, and Miz just escaped. Lunatic lariat turns the Miz almost inside out. What the?
É uma autêntica selvageria. É uma autêntica brutalidade, selvageria. Esta pessoa está
As a matter of time of pandemonium. And that's what we're seeing. And signs of things to come 5 days from tonight at the 30th annual Royal Rumble.
Não autêntica selvageria, não autêntica isto. Isso é um parlamento inteiro. Não é só uma pessoa, não. Tem um parlamento inteiro que se comporta assim. Este tipo de pessoas que vocês querem no nosso país.
Going for broken. He's lucky he didn't break anything as he wipes out the Miz and the Lumberjacks. Somewhere in that pile is his opponent, the Miz. There he is.
Não estou para invadir Uganda ou para matar todos os pretos por causa dessa selvageria. Estou para não deixar entrar cá em Portugal. Não deixar esse tipo de selvageria entrar em Portugal.
The Intercontinental Championship up for grabs. The Miz nursing his right rib cage.
So before saying anything about the US,
enthralled with the action. Time to clean it houses. This is supposed to be for the Intercontinental Championship. Bridge. The Miz. Oh, and Ambrose kicks out just in the nick of time. Ambrose got him.
Here's your winner and still the Intercontinental Champion, Dean Ambrose.
Dean Ambrose enters his 4th with to help Dean Ambrose. They're jealous of the